The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross, and Scott Wright felt his world tilt on its axis as Jose Peterson reached up to cup his face with trembling hands. The confession had torn through him like lightning, splitting open years of carefully constructed walls, and now Jose was looking at him with eyes that held every answer Scott had been afraid to hope for. The apartment around them seemed to fade into insignificance as Jose whispered, his voice barely audible above the thundering of Scott's heart. I've been lying to myself for so long, but I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is just friendship. Scott's breath caught in his throat, his fingers instinctively finding Jose's wrists, holding on to him as if he might disappear at any moment. The golden light from the lamp cast shadows across Jose's face, highlighting the vulnerability there, the fear and hope warring in his expression. For 2 years and 4 months, Scott had carried this secret like a stone in his chest, watching Jose navigate relationship after relationship, offering advice and comfort while his own heart broke a little more each time. Now, standing in this moment that felt both inevitable and impossible, Scott could barely form the words that had lived inside him for so long. Jose, he breathed, and the name felt different on his lips now, charged with possibility instead of longing. I've loved you since the day you moved in next door and asked to borrow sugar, then stayed for 3 hours talking about everything except the recipe you needed it for. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments because this story is about to take you on an emotional journey that will leave you believing in the power of unexpected love. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, suspended between confession and kiss, between friendship and something infinitely more precious. The story must begin 3 months earlier, when Scott Wright thought he had successfully buried his feelings so deep that even he couldn't find them anymore. The morning had started like any other, with Scott padding barefoot to his kitchen to find Jose already there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee and that familiar expression of quiet frustration that had become increasingly common over the past few weeks. Jose's dark hair was still mussed from sleep, and he wore an old college sweatshirt that hung loose on his frame, making him look younger and more vulnerable than his 28 years. Scott had learned to read the subtle signs of Jose's moods like a language he'd spent years perfecting, and everything about his posture screamed that another fight with his girlfriend Emma had kept him awake. Rough night? Scott asked, though he already knew the answer. He busied himself with making his own coffee, grateful for the excuse to keep his hands occupied and his eyes focused on something other than the way Jose's lips curved around the rim of his mug. Jose let out a long sigh, running his free hand through his hair in a gesture that Scott had cataloged among the many unconscious things Jose did when he was trying to work through a problem. Emma thinks I'm distant, Jose said, his voice carrying that particular tone of exhaustion that came from having the same argument multiple times. She says I'm physically there, but emotionally somewhere else. And honestly, Scott, I don't know how to argue with that because she's not wrong. Scott felt the familiar knife twist in his chest, the one that came every time Jose opened up about his relationship troubles. For months now, Scott had played the role of the supportive friend, listening to Jose's frustrations about feeling disconnected from Emma, offering advice that he hoped sounded genuine, while secretly cataloging every sign that Jose's relationship was falling apart. The guilt of hoping for his friend's relationship to fail warred constantly with his genuine desire for Jose's happiness, creating an internal conflict that left Scott feeling like he was living a double life. What do you mean emotionally somewhere else? Scott asked, settling into the chair across from Jose at the small kitchen table that had become their unofficial meeting place for these early morning conversations. The question felt dangerous on his tongue, like he was probing a wound that might reveal too much, but he couldn't help himself. Every conversation with Jose felt like a puzzle piece, and Scott was desperately trying to assemble them into a picture he could understand. Jose stared into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers, his brows drawn together in concentration. It's like there's this part of me that's always holding back, he said slowly, clearly trying to articulate something he'd been struggling to understand. Even when we're being intimate, even when she's telling me she loves me, there's this voice in my head that keeps asking if this is really what I want. if this is really what love is supposed to feel like." The words hit Scott like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands tremble slightly around his coffee mug. He'd heard Jose express doubts about his relationship before, but never with this level of raw honesty, never with this hint that the problem might be deeper than simple compatibility issues. Scott forced himself to take a steady sip of coffee, using the moment to compose his expression into something that resembled casual concern rather than desperate hope. "Have you talked to her about how you're feeling?" Scott asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The rational part of his mind, the part that genuinely cared about Jose's well-being, knew that honest communication might save the relationship. The selfish part, the part that had been quietly nurturing hope for over 2 years, whispered that some problems couldn't be solved with better communication. Jose shook his head, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "How do you tell someone you've been dating for 8 months that you're not sure you're capable of loving them the way they deserve? How do you explain that every time they touch you, you feel like you're playing a role in someone else's life?" The vulnerability in Jose's voice made Scott's chest ache with a different kind of pain, the kind that came from watching someone he loved struggle with questions that Scott couldn't help him answer without revealing too much of himself. Scott reached across the table without thinking, his fingers brushing against Jose's knuckles in what was meant to be a brief, comforting gesture. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, and when Jose didn't pull away, when his fingers actually shifted to allow their hands to touch more fully, Scott felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. "Maybe the problem isn't that you can't love her the way she deserves," Scott said quietly, his thumb unconsciously tracing a small pattern across Jose's knuckles. "Maybe the problem is that you're trying to force yourself to feel something that isn't there, and that's not fair to either of you." Jose's eyes met his across the table, and Scott saw something flicker there, a moment of recognition that felt both thrilling and terrifying. For a heartbeat, the space between them felt charged with possibility, and Scott wondered if Jose could hear the truth hidden in his carefully neutral words. Then Jose's phone buzzed against the table, Emma's name lighting up the screen, and the moment shattered like glass. Jose pulled his hand away to answer the call, and Scott felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. He listened to one side of a conversation that sounded strained and apologetic, Jose's voice taking on a tone that Scott had come to recognize as his relationship maintenance voice. Polite and caring, but lacking the warmth and authenticity that characterized his interactions with Scott. When Jose hung up, he looked tired in a way that went beyond simple sleep deprivation. "She wants to have dinner tonight to talk things through," Jose said, though he didn't sound particularly enthusiastic about the prospect. "She thinks we can work through whatever's wrong if we just try harder." Scott nodded, swallowing down the words he wanted to say, the questions he wanted to ask about whether trying harder was really the solution, when the fundamental problem seemed to be that Jose was trying to be someone he wasn't. Instead, he offered what he hoped was an encouraging smile and said, "Maybe that's exactly what you both need. A chance to really talk about what you want." The rest of the morning passed in companionable silence, but Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them during that conversation. Jose seemed more thoughtful than usual, his gaze lingering on Scott in moments when he thought Scott wasn't looking. And when he left for work, his goodbye hug lasted a few seconds longer than normal, his hand lingering on Scott's shoulder in a way that felt deliberately meaningful. That evening, Scott tried to distract himself with work, but his mind kept wandering to Jose's dinner with Emma, imagining conversations he had no right to be curious about. He'd settled on the couch with his laptop, attempting to focus on a project deadline, when he heard Jose's key in the lock. The sound came earlier than expected, and something about the way Jose closed the door, quiet and careful, made Scott look up from his screen with concern. Jose appeared in the doorway of the living room, still wearing his work clothes but with his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through his hair. His expression was unreadable, a careful blank mask that Scott had learned meant Jose was processing something significant. "How did dinner go?" Scott asked, though Jose's early return and subdued demeanor already suggested the answer. Jose didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed the room and sank onto the opposite end of the couch, leaving a careful distance between them that somehow felt more significant than their usual casual closeness. He stared at his hands for a long moment before finally speaking. "We broke up," Jose said simply, his voice carrying a complex mix of relief and sadness that Scott couldn't quite parse. "It was mutual, I think, or as mutual as these things ever really are." Scott felt his heart skip a beat, hope and concern warring in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it, even as part of him wanted to celebrate. "Are you okay?" Jose let out a long breath, finally looking up to meet Scott's eyes. "I think I am, actually. That's the weird part. I thought I'd be more upset, but mostly I just feel like I can finally stop pretending to be someone I'm not." He paused, his gaze searching Scott's face for something. "She said something tonight that I can't stop thinking about." "What did she say?" Scott asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "She said that in all the time we've been together, I never looked at her the way I look at you." Jose's words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Scott's mouth go dry. "She said she'd been trying to convince herself that she was imagining it, but tonight she realized she couldn't compete with whatever this is between us." Scott felt the world tilt slightly, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of Jose's revelation. "Jose," he started, but Jose held up a hand, clearly needing to finish what he'd started. "The thing is, Scott, I couldn't even argue with her because I didn't know what she meant. I don't know how I look at you. I don't know what this is between us." Jose's voice was quiet but intense, his eyes never leaving Scott's face. "But I've been thinking about it all the way home, and I realized that every relationship I've ever had has felt like I was trying to fit into a role that didn't quite match who I am. Every time someone told me they loved me, there was this part of me that wondered if they would still love me if they knew who I really was underneath all the pretending." The vulnerability in Jose's voice made Scott's chest tight with emotion. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them on the couch, but something about the careful space Jose had left between them suggested that this conversation required a different kind of navigation. "Who are you underneath the pretending?" Scott asked softly, the question feeling both necessary and terrifying. Jose was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to his hands again. When he looked back up, there was something raw and uncertain in his expression that Scott had never seen before. "I don't know," Jose admitted, "but I think I want to find out, and I think maybe I need to figure that out before I can be fair to anyone else." The conversation continued late into the night, meandering through topics that felt both safe and loaded with subtext. They talked about Jose's pattern of relationships, about the pressure to follow expected timelines and milestones, about the difference between loving someone and being in love with them. Scott found himself sharing more than he'd intended, talking about his own struggles with dating, his sense that he'd never found the kind of connection that other people seemed to take for granted. As the hours passed, they gradually migrated closer together on the couch, the careful distance Jose had initially maintained slowly dissolving as the conversation deepened. By the time they were both yawning and considering bed, Jose's shoulder was pressed against Scott's, and Scott could feel the warmth radiating from Jose's body like a promise of something he didn't dare name. "Thank you," Jose said as they finally stood to head to their respective bedrooms, "for listening, for not judging, for just being you." The words were simple, but something about the way Jose said them, the way his hand briefly touched Scott's arm as he spoke, felt like the beginning of a conversation that would continue in the spaces between words, in glances and gestures and moments of connection that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge directly. The weeks that followed Jose's breakup with Emma created a new dynamic between them that Scott found both exhilarating and terrifying. Jose seemed more relaxed, more present in their interactions, as if breaking up with Emma had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Their morning coffee conversations became longer and more intimate, touching on subjects they'd never explored before. Jose talked about feeling like he'd been sleepwalking through his adult life, going through the motions of what he thought he was supposed to want without ever questioning whether those things actually made him happy. Scott found himself walking a careful line between offering support and protecting his own heart. Every conversation felt like it contained hidden meanings. Every casual touch seemed charged with possibility, and Scott caught himself analyzing Jose's words and gestures, for signs of something that might not exist outside his own wishful thinking. The rational part of his mind reminded him constantly that Jose was simply going through a period of self-discovery after a breakup, that reading romantic significance into their friendship was dangerous and potentially destructive. But then there were moments that felt impossible to misinterpret. Moments when Jose's gaze would linger on Scott's face with an intensity that made Scott's breath catch, or when Jose would find excuses for casual physical contact that seemed to last just a beat longer than friendship required. 3 weeks after the breakup, Jose started a habit of falling asleep on Scott's couch during their movie nights, claiming he was too tired to make it to his own room, but never actually making an effort to leave. Scott would cover him with a blanket and retreat to his own bedroom, but not before allowing himself a few moments to study Jose's sleeping face, memorizing the way his features softened in sleep, the way his dark lashes cast shadows on his cheekbones. The shift became impossible to ignore on a Thursday evening when Jose appeared at Scott's door with takeout and an expression that suggested he had something specific on his mind. They'd fallen into an easy routine of sharing dinner a few times a week, but something about Jose's demeanor felt different, more purposeful than their usual casual companionship. "I've been thinking about what Emma said," Jose announced without preamble as they settled at Scott's kitchen table with their food. "About the way I look at you." Scott nearly choked on his first bite, his heart immediately launching into a rapid rhythm that he hoped wasn't audible across the table. "Oh," he managed, aiming for casual interest while internally scrambling for safe ground. "I asked my sister about it," Jose continued, seemingly oblivious to Scott's sudden tension. "I described our friendship to her, told her about the things Emma said, and asked her if she thought there was something I was missing." The mention of Jose's sister made Scott's stomach drop. Gloria Carter was perceptive and direct, not someone who would sugarcoat her observations if she thought her brother was blind to something obvious. Scott had met her a few times and liked her, but the thought of Jose's family discussing his feelings, even indirectly, made him feel exposed and vulnerable. "What did she say?" Scott asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know the answer. Jose set down his fork and looked directly at Scott, his expression serious. "She asked me if I'd ever been attracted to a man." The words hung between them like a challenge, and Scott felt his world narrow to the space across the small table, to Jose's dark eyes and the careful way he was watching Scott's reaction. Scott's mouth went dry, and he found himself gripping his water glass tighter than necessary, using the cool surface to ground himself in the moment. "What did you tell her?" Scott asked, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "I told her I didn't think so," Jose said slowly. "But then she asked me how I would know if I'd never really considered the possibility." Jose paused, his gaze never leaving Scott's face. "And I realized that I've spent so much time trying to fit into the life I thought I was supposed to want that I never questioned whether there might be other possibilities." Scott felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong word away from falling into something that would change everything between them. "Have you been questioning it now?" he asked, the words feeling dangerous and necessary in equal measure. Jose nodded, a slight flush creeping up his neck. "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. About why my relationships with women always felt like I was playing a role. About why I feel more like myself when I'm with you than I do with anyone else. About why the thought of you dating someone makes me feel sick to my stomach." The confession hit Scott like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands shake slightly. He set down his water glass carefully, afraid he might drop it, and tried to process what Jose was telling him. The hope that had been carefully contained in his chest for over 2 years suddenly felt too big for his body, threatening to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. "Jose," Scott started, but Jose held up a hand, clearly needing to finish what he'd started. "I know this is probably weird to hear," Jose continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "And I know our friendship is important and I don't want to mess that up. But I also can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you that I've never felt for anyone else." The words Scott had dreamed of hearing for so long felt surreal now that they were actually being spoken. He stared at Jose across the table, taking in the nervous energy radiating from him, the way his hands fidgeted with his napkin, the hope and fear warring in his expression. How long have you been feeling this way? Scott asked quietly. Jose let out a shaky laugh. I think part of me has always felt this way, but I was so good at convincing myself it was just friendship that I didn't recognize it for what it was. It wasn't until Emma pointed out how I look at you that I started paying attention to how I actually feel when I'm with you versus how I feel when I'm with other people. Scott felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Jose was sharing with him. The careful walls he'd built around his feelings began to crumble as he realized that the connection he'd felt between them hadn't been one-sided wishful thinking after all. I need to tell you something, Scott said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been in love with you for over 2 years. Since the day you moved in next door and we spent 3 hours talking about everything except the sugar you'd come to borrow. Jose's eyes widened, and Scott saw something like relief wash over his features. 2 years? Jose asked, and Scott could hear the wonder in his voice. 2 years and 4 months, Scott confirmed, a watery smile breaking across his face. I've watched you date Emma and listened to you talk about your relationship problems, and every time you asked me for advice, I wanted to tell you that maybe the reason you felt disconnected was because you were with the wrong person entirely. Jose pushed back from the table and crossed the small space between them, dropping to his knees beside Scott's chair and taking Scott's hands in his own. The contact sent electricity shooting up Scott's arms, and he found himself cataloging every detail of the moment. The way Jose's thumbs brushed across his knuckles, the intensity in Jose's dark eyes, the way the kitchen light cast a warm glow across Jose's features. I'm scared, Jose admitted, his voice vulnerable in a way that made Scott's heart ache. I've never felt this way about a man before, and I don't know what it means or how to navigate it. But I know that when I'm with you, I feel more like myself than I ever have before, and I can't keep pretending that's not significant. Scott squeezed Jose's hands, grounding them both in the moment. We don't have to figure it all out right now, he said softly. We can take this as slowly as you need to. I've waited over 2 years. I can wait as long as you need me to. Jose's eyes fluttered closed for a moment, and when he opened them again, Scott saw a determination there that hadn't been present before. I don't want to wait anymore, Jose said. I've spent too much of my life waiting for permission to want what I actually want instead of what I think I'm supposed to want. The space between them felt charged with possibility, and Scott found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the magnetic pull of Jose's proximity. Jose's gaze dropped to Scott's lips for a brief, unmistakable moment, and Scott felt his breath catch in anticipation. Can I kiss you? Jose asked, his voice so quiet that Scott almost wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Scott's response was barely a whisper. Yes. The first brush of Jose's lips against his was tentative, questioning, a gentle exploration that sent shockwaves through Scott's entire body. Scott had imagined this moment countless times over the past 2 years, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of Jose's mouth against his, soft and warm and perfect, in a way that made Scott's knees weak with relief. The kiss deepened as Jose's initial hesitation melted away, his hands coming up to frame Scott's face as Scott's fingers tangled in Jose's dark hair. There was an urgency to the contact that spoke of months of suppressed longing finally being released, and Scott felt like he was drowning in the sensation of finally being able to touch Jose the way he'd dreamed of for so long. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jose rested his forehead against Scott's, his eyes still closed as if he was trying to memorize the moment. Wow, Jose breathed, and Scott could hear the wonder in his voice. Yeah, Scott agreed, his own voice rough with emotion. Wow. They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, neither wanting to break the spell of intimacy that surrounded them. Scott could feel Jose's pulse racing beneath his fingertips, where they rested against Jose's neck, could see the flush that had spread across Jose's cheekbones, could smell the familiar scent of Jose's cologne, mixed with something new and electric, that Scott realized was the scent of possibility. I've never felt anything like that before, Jose said quietly, his eyes opening to meet Scott's gaze. Is it supposed to feel like that? Scott's heart clenched at the vulnerability in Jose's voice, at the realization that Jose was navigating not just new feelings for Scott specifically, but an entirely new understanding of his own sexuality and desires. "It's supposed to feel right," Scott said softly, "and this feels pretty right to me." Jose smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed his entire face. "It feels more than right," he said. "It feels like coming home." The weeks that followed their first kiss unfolded like a slow revelation, each day bringing new discoveries about themselves and each other. Jose approached his newfound attraction to Scott with the same methodical curiosity he brought to everything else in his life, asking questions and sharing observations with an openness that sometimes left Scott breathless with affection. They spent hours talking about sexuality and identity, about the difference between attraction and love, about the ways that societal expectations had shaped their understanding of what relationships were supposed to look like. Jose was fascinated by the realization that his previous relationships had felt like performances because, in many ways, they had been. He'd been playing the role of the straight boyfriend without ever questioning whether that role suited him, following scripts about romance and attraction that had never quite resonated with his actual experience. With Scott, everything felt natural and unforced, from the way their conversations flowed seamlessly between topics to the way their bodies seemed to fit together when they kissed. Their physical relationship progressed slowly, with Jose setting the pace as he explored what felt good and right to him. Scott was endlessly patient, content to follow Jose's lead and provide reassurance whenever Jose's inexperience with same-sex relationships made him uncertain or self-conscious. They spent evenings curled together on the couch, Jose's head on Scott's shoulder as they watched movies, Jose's hand tracing absent patterns on Scott's chest as they talked about their days. The domesticity of it all felt revolutionary to Jose, who had never experienced the kind of easy intimacy that seemed to exist naturally between him and Scott. With Emma and his previous girlfriends, even simple acts like sharing breakfast or deciding what to watch on television had required negotiation and compromise. With Scott, everything felt effortless, as if they'd been designed to complement each other. "I think I understand now what people mean when they talk about soulmates," Jose said one evening as they lay in Scott's bed, Jose's fingers intertwined with Scott's in the space between them. They'd been together for 6 weeks, and Jose's comfort with physical intimacy had grown steadily as he'd learned to trust his own desires and reactions. Scott turned to face him, studying Jose's profile in the dim light filtering through the bedroom curtains. "Yeah?" Jose nodded, his thumb brushing across Scott's knuckles in a gesture that had become habitual between them. "I used to think that was just romantic nonsense, the idea that there was one person out there who could understand you completely. But being with you feels like finding a part of myself I didn't know was missing." The words made Scott's chest tight with emotion, and he leaned over to press a soft kiss to Jose's temple. "I love you," he said quietly, the words feeling both significant and natural. They'd been dancing around the declaration for weeks, but this felt like the right moment to make it explicit. Jose's eyes fluttered closed, and Scott could see the emotion playing across his features. "I love you too," Jose whispered. "I think I have for a long time, but I was too scared to let myself recognize it." They made love that night with a tenderness and intensity that left them both shaking with emotion afterward. Jose cried a little, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered about himself and about love, and Scott held him close, whispering reassurances and promises into his hair until Jose's breathing evened out in sleep. The next morning brought new challenges as Jose began the process of coming out to his family and friends. His sister Gloria was unsurprised but supportive, admitting that she'd suspected for years that Jose's relationships with women weren't fulfilling him in the way they should. His parents required more time to process the news, but their love for Jose ultimately trumped their initial confusion and concern. The hardest conversation was with Emma, who had remained in their extended friend group and deserved an explanation for why her instincts about Jose and Scott had been correct. Jose met her for coffee on a Saturday afternoon, nervous but determined to be honest about what he'd discovered about himself. Scott waited at home, anxious and supportive, ready to provide comfort if the conversation went poorly. Jose returned home that evening with red-rimmed eyes but a peaceful expression. "She said she was glad I figured it out," he told Scott as they settled on the couch together. "She said she could see how much happier I am now, and that she hoped I'd find the courage to be honest about who I really am." And how do you feel about who you really are? Scott asked, pulling Jose close against his side. Jose was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I feel like I'm finally living in my own life instead of someone else's, he said eventually. I feel like I spent 28 years trying to fit into a box that was never designed for me, and now I get to build something that actually fits. As spring turned to summer, Jose and Scott settled into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, as if they'd been meant to find their way to each other all along. Jose's confidence in his identity grew stronger each day, and he began to talk about their future together with a certainty that made Scott's heart soar. They discussed moving in together officially, combining their apartments into a shared space that would belong to both of them, rather than feeling like Scott was hosting Jose in his domain. The conversation about their future happened on a warm evening in late June as they sat on Scott's small balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jose had been quieter than usual all day, and Scott could sense that he was working through something significant. I've been thinking about Emma's wedding invitation, Jose said eventually, his fingers playing with the stem of his wine glass. Emma had gotten engaged to someone new, a development that had surprised everyone with its speed but seemed to make her genuinely happy. The invitation had arrived the week before, addressed to Jose with a +1 that everyone understood was meant for Scott. What about it? Scott asked, though he suspected he knew where the conversation was heading. I want to go, Jose said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. And I want to go with you and as your boyfriend, not as your friend who happens to be your +1. He turned to face Scott fully, his expression serious. I want people to know that we're together, that this isn't just some phase I'm going through or some experiment I'm trying out. I want them to know that you're the person I love and that I'm proud to be with you. The declaration made Scott's throat tight with emotion. He knew how significant this was for Jose, who had spent most of his life carefully maintaining a public image that aligned with other people's expectations. Attending Emma's wedding as an openly gay couple would be Jose's most public declaration of his identity, a statement that he was ready to live authentically regardless of other people's reactions. Are you sure? Scott asked gently. That's going to be a lot of people who knew you when you were dating Emma. There might be questions, comments, people who don't understand. Jose nodded firmly. I'm sure. I've spent too much of my life worrying about what other people think, and I'm done with that. I know who I am now, and I know what makes me happy. If other people have a problem with that, that's their issue to work through, not mine. The wedding took place on a perfect Saturday in July, and Scott felt his heart swell with pride as he watched Jose navigate the social dynamics with grace and confidence. Jose introduced Scott as his boyfriend without hesitation, fielding questions and comments with a combination of honesty and gentle firmness that shut down any potential negativity before it could take root. Emma looked radiant and genuinely happy, and when she hugged Jose during the reception, Scott could see the mutual affection and respect that had survived the end of their romantic relationship. Thank you, Emma said to Scott when Jose stepped away to get them drinks, for helping him figure out who he really is. I could see how much he was struggling when we were together, but I didn't know how to help him find what he was looking for. He figured it out himself, Scott replied. I just happened to be here when he was ready to see it. Emma smiled, her expression warm and knowing. You're good for each other? I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he lights up when you're around. That's what love is supposed to look like. Later that evening, as they slow danced to a song that Jose hummed softly in Scott's ear, Scott felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Jose's arms were strong and sure around him, and when Jose pulled back to look into his eyes, Scott saw contentment there that had been missing for as long as he'd known him. No regrets? Scott asked quietly, aware that this public declaration of their relationship represented a point of no return for Jose. Jose's smile was radiant. Only that it took me so long to get here, he said. But maybe I needed to go through everything I went through to be ready to appreciate what we have. They left the wedding that night hand in hand, and Scott felt like they were walking into a future that belonged entirely to them. The months of uncertainty and careful navigation had given way to something solid and sure, a foundation they could build on for whatever came next. The autumn brought new developments as Jose and Scott officially moved in together, combining their belongings and their lives in ways that felt both practical and symbolic. Jose had worried that living together might change the dynamic between them, that the constant proximity might diminish the excitement and novelty of their relationship. Instead, he found that sharing space with Scott felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if they'd been designed to complement each other's daily rhythms and habits. Scott was a morning person who liked to start his day with coffee and quiet contemplation, while Jose preferred to ease into wakefulness with conversation and physical affection. They found a balance that honored both preferences, with Scott making coffee while Jose slowly emerged from sleep, and Jose providing the gentle human connection that helped Scott transition from his internal morning routine to engagement with the world. Their evening routines evolved organically as well, with Jose often cooking dinner while Scott handled work calls or emails, then coming together to share the meal and decompress from their respective days. They developed a habit of taking walks after dinner when the weather was nice, using the time to talk through any challenges or concerns that had arisen during their time apart. I never realized how lonely I was before, Jose confessed one evening as they walked through their neighborhood, the autumn air crisp and clean around them. Even when I was in relationships, even when I was surrounded by people, there was always this sense that I was fundamentally alone because no one really knew who I was underneath all the pretending. Scott squeezed Jose's hand, understanding exactly what he meant. I felt the same way, he said, like I was always performing a version of myself that I thought other people would find acceptable, but never really connecting with anyone on a level that felt authentic. Do you think that's why it took us so long to figure this out? Jose asked. Because we were both so good at hiding who we really were that we couldn't see each other clearly? Scott considered the question as they paused at a corner, waiting for the light to change. Maybe, he said eventually, or maybe we needed to go through all of that pretending to be ready to appreciate something real when we found it. Their relationship continued to deepen as they navigated their first major holidays together. Thanksgiving was spent with Jose's family, who had fully embraced Scott as a member of their extended clan. Jose's mother fussed over Scott's eating habits and shared embarrassing childhood stories about Jose, while his father engaged Scott in lengthy discussions about sports and politics. Gloria pulled Scott aside after dinner to thank him for making her brother so happy, and Scott felt a profound sense of belonging that he'd never experienced with anyone else's family. Christmas brought its own challenges and joys as they established new traditions that honored both of their backgrounds while creating something uniquely theirs. They spent Christmas Eve with Scott's family and Christmas Day with Jose's, then returned home to exchange gifts in the quiet intimacy of their shared space. Jose's gift to Scott was a framed photograph from Emma's wedding, a candid shot of them dancing that captured the joy and contentment on both their faces. On the back, Jose had written, "To Scott, who helped me find my way home to myself. I love you more than words can express." Scott's gift to Jose was a key to the house they had been looking at together, a small craftsman with a garden and enough space for the future they had been dreaming about. Jose's eyes filled with tears when he realized what the key represented, and he launched himself into Scott's arms with a force that knocked them both backward onto the couch. "Are you serious?" Jose asked, his voice muffled against Scott's neck. "Dead serious," Scott replied, his arms tightening around Jose's waist. "I want to build a life with you, Jose. I want us to have a home that belongs to both of us, a place where we can be completely ourselves without any pretending or performing." The new year brought with it a sense of possibility and permanence that felt both exciting and grounding. Jose had fully settled into his identity as a gay man in a committed relationship, and the confidence he'd gained in understanding himself had spilled over into other areas of his life. He'd gotten a promotion at work, started volunteering with a local LGBTQ youth organization, and begun talking about the possibility of going back to school to pursue a degree in counseling. "I keep thinking about all the years I spent feeling confused and disconnected," Jose explained one evening as they painted the living room of their new house. "And I wonder how many other people are out there struggling with the same things, trying to figure out who they are underneath all the expectations and assumptions. Scott paused in his painting to watch Jose work, admiring both his physical grace and his emotional generosity. Jose had thrown himself into the house project with enthusiasm, researching color schemes and furniture arrangements with the same attention to detail he brought to everything else in his life. But more than that, Scott was continually amazed by Jose's capacity for growth and his desire to use his own experiences to help other people. "You'd be a good counselor," Scott said, meaning it completely. "You have this way of making people feel safe to be vulnerable, and you understand what it's like to feel lost and find your way." Jose smiled, a streak of pale blue paint across his cheekbone where he'd unconsciously touched his face. "I never thought I'd be grateful for all those years of confusion and pretending, but I'm starting to see them as preparation for something bigger. Like maybe I had to go through all of that so I could help other people find their way through it too." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythm of painting meditative and satisfying. The house was slowly becoming theirs, each room reflecting their combined tastes and shared vision for the life they wanted to build together. Scott found himself stealing glances at Jose as they worked, still sometimes amazed by the reality of their relationship, by the fact that this beautiful, thoughtful man had chosen to build a life with him. "What are you thinking about?" Jose asked, catching one of Scott's lingering looks. "Just how happy I am," Scott said simply. "How grateful I am that you were brave enough to question everything you thought you knew about yourself." Jose set down his paintbrush and crossed the room to where Scott was working, wrapping his arms around Scott's waist from behind and resting his chin on Scott's shoulder. "I'm grateful that you were patient enough to wait for me to figure it out," he said, "and that you loved me enough to let me find my own way, instead of trying to push me toward any particular conclusion." Scott leaned back into Jose's embrace, feeling the solid warmth of Jose's chest against his back, the steady rhythm of Jose's breathing, the security of Jose's arms around him. "I would have waited forever," he said quietly, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." They finished painting as the sun set outside their windows, the warm light casting golden shadows across the pale blue walls. As they cleaned their brushes and put away their supplies, Scott felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond the simple pleasure of completing a task. This house, this life they were building together, felt like the culmination of everything he'd hoped for during those long months of loving Jose from a distance. That night, as they lay in their bed in their house, Jose curled against Scott's side with his head on Scott's chest. Scott felt a profound sense of completion. The journey from friendship to love hadn't been easy or straightforward, but it had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment, this sense of being exactly where they belonged. "I love you," Jose murmured sleepily, his breath warm against Scott's skin. "I love you too," Scott replied, his hand stroking gently through Jose's dark hair. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." As Jose's breathing evened out in sleep, Scott lay awake for a while longer, thinking about the path that had brought them here. The months of uncertainty and careful navigation, the courage it had taken for Jose to question everything he'd believed about himself, the patience required to let their relationship develop at its own pace. All of it had led to this moment, to this life they were building together, to this love that felt both surprising and inevitable. The story of how they'd found each other wasn't the one either of them had expected to live, but it was theirs, and it was perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its complexity. They'd both had to lose themselves a little to find each other, had to question everything they thought they knew about love and identity and desire. But in the end, they'd found something worth all the confusion and uncertainty, something that felt like coming home to themselves and each other simultaneously. Scott closed his eyes and let himself drift towards sleep, Jose's warm weight against his side, their future stretching out before them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and discoveries, new opportunities to grow together and support each other's continued evolution. But tonight, in this moment, they had everything they needed: each other, this home they'd created, and the deep, abiding love that had brought them through uncertainty to this place of peace and possibility.